I never thought a quiet afternoon grocery run would turn into something that would sit with me for days. My name is Denzel, and though some recognize my face from the silver screen, today I was just a man picking up a few things. Bananas, bread, a carton of milk. Nothing out of the ordinary. I like the simple things, the everyday moments where I could just be. The grocery store was buzzing with life, people moving through the aisles, chatting, kids laughing, and carts clattering against the tiled floor. The golden sunlight filtered through the glass entrance, giving everything a warm glow. I was in the produce section when I saw her. An elderly woman, small frame but sturdy, dressed in a pale pink sweater with neatly pressed slacks. Her white hair was styled perfectly, glasses perched on her nose. She looked like someone's sweet grandmother, but the tight press of her lips told a different story. She reached for a bag of oranges, muttering under her breath. I wouldn't have thought much of it until her gaze landed on me, and suddenly, something in her eyes changed. "People like you don't belong here," she said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. For a moment, I wasn't sure she was talking to me, but then she straightened, her grip tightening on the cart. "You should go back to Africa." A thick silence blanketed the store. The rhythm of casual conversations and the mechanical hum of refrigerators faded. A young man stocking lettuce froze, a head of romaine motionless in his hands. A mother pushing a stroller turned sharply, her mouth slightly open. I could feel eyes shifting toward me, waiting to see how I would react. I placed the apple back on the stand, my fingers lingering for a brief moment. My heart beat steadily, not out of anger, but out of something deeper. An understanding of moments like these. They weren't new to me. They weren't new to the world. I took a breath, steadying myself. "Ma'am," I said, my voice even. "Do you know what you just said?" Her expression didn't change. If anything, it hardened. "I said what I meant. This is my country. You don't belong here." A cough sounded from the bread aisle. The teenager near the cereal shelf whispered to her friend, but no one stepped forward. No one said a word. I studied her for a moment. Her chin was raised, her hands gripping the cart as if bracing herself for a fight. "You believe that?" I asked, not with anger, but with a quiet curiosity. Her arms crossed over her chest. "I do." The silence stretched, thick and unyielding. The weight of history, of stories untold, of lives lived and lost, hung between us. I nodded, shifting the basket in my hand. "All right," I said. "Let's talk about it." The air in the store seemed to shift. Shoppers who had been pretending not to notice were now openly watching. The cashier at the front of the store leaned over the counter, craning her neck. A man in the dairy aisle stood frozen, a carton of eggs in his hand. Mrs. Whitaker, as I would later learn her name, narrowed her eyes. "There's nothing to talk about," she snapped. But I didn't move. I let the silence sit between us, heavy and important. "You think I don't belong here," I said finally, my voice steady. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." Even the refrigerators seemed quieter. Every pair of eyes stayed fixed on us. "My great-grandparents worked this land," I said. "Not by choice, but by force. They were brought here in chains, made to work under the harshest conditions, all so this country could be built." Mrs. Whitaker's face tightened. She said nothing. "My father," I continued, "fought for this country. He wore a uniform, risked his life, and when he came home, he still wasn't treated as an equal. But he didn't complain. He didn't turn his back on this country. Instead, he taught me to believe in its promise, the promise that we're all created equal." The tension in the store shifted. Discomfort gave way to something deeper, a collective moment of reflection. A young mother holding a basket of groceries nodded slowly. An older man near the deli counter whispered, "That's the truth." "So when you tell me I don't belong here," I said, "what you're really saying is that my contributions, my family's sacrifices, don't matter. But I'll tell you this, ma'am, I belong here just as much as you do, maybe even more." Mrs. Whitaker's lips parted, but no words came. Her stance softened, if only just a little. She looked around, as if searching for agreement, but no one spoke in her defense. The silence stretched again, but this time, It wasn't filled with tension. It was filled with possibility. She gripped the handle of her cart tightly. Her face, once rigid with certainty, shifted, just enough to reveal uncertainty. I stood calmly. I didn't press her. I let her sit in the weight of her own words. "You don't have to answer me," I said gently. She exhaled sharply, almost an automatic response, as if she needed to fill the silence. I nodded at her, not unkindly. "But I'd like you to think about something," I continued. "What does it mean to belong? Is it about where we were born, the color of our skin? Or is it about the kind of life we live, the values we hold, and the legacy we leave behind?" She swallowed hard, looking down at the apples in her cart. Near the frozen food section, a teenage boy whispered, "He's so calm." His mother nodded, eyes locked on the scene. "I'm not here to argue with you," I said, "and I'm not here to change your mind. That's something only you can do. But I do want to leave you with this. Belonging isn't about dividing people. It's about connecting with each other. It's about finding common ground and building from there." A woman near the bread aisle murmured, "That's true." Mrs. Whitaker's head tilted slightly, as if she were listening, even if she didn't want to admit it. Her grip on the cart loosened. I took a step back, letting the moment belong to her. Change doesn't happen all at once. It starts with a single moment. Sometimes all we need is to pause, to listen, to see the world a little differently than we did before. And maybe, just maybe, this was that moment. Mrs. Whitaker's face shifted as she looked around, searching for someone to validate her stance. But the weight of the silence in the store was undeniable. No one spoke in her defense. No one nodded in agreement. Instead, the faces around us reflected something else: expectation. She hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly on the cart handle. Her eyes darted to the young store clerk, Aaron, who had been shelving yogurt earlier but was now standing near the dairy section, watching intently. His posture was tense, as if he were holding back words. Then, in a voice just loud enough for everyone to hear, Aaron finally spoke. "He's right." The sound of his voice sliced through the stillness. Mrs. Whitaker turned, startled. "I grew up here in Savannah," he continued, his voice gaining confidence. "My mom works 3 jobs. My dad served in the Army. We've worked hard, just like everyone else. And I've always felt like this was my home, because it is." He swallowed, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "No one should be told they don't belong here." Mrs. Whitaker's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Doubt, defensiveness, regret. Before she could respond, another voice joined in. "My father always said the same thing." A woman by the cereal aisle spoke up. Mrs. Jenkins, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair, clutched a box of Cheerios to her chest. "It doesn't matter what you look like or where your ancestors came from. What matters is how you live your life." Murmurs of agreement spread through the store like ripples in water. A woman near the bakery section nodded. An older man by the deli counter whispered, "That's the truth." For the first time since this started, Mrs. Whitaker seemed small. I watched as her posture shifted, her shoulders sagging slightly. Her hands loosened their grip on the cart. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. The thing about moments like these is that change doesn't come easy. People don't wake up and suddenly see the world differently. But sometimes, just sometimes, a seed is planted. I took a step back, giving her space. "Mrs. Whitaker," I said gently, "I know change isn't easy. I know it's hard to look at the world differently than you've been taught. But it's worth it, for all of us." She blinked, her eyes searching mine. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, without another word, she gripped her card and turned, walking away. The spell was broken. People exhaled. Conversation started again, though quieter than before. The young mother near the bread aisle picked up her shopping list, tucking it into her purse. Miss Jenkins lingered for a moment before moving toward the checkout lane. Aaron looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said softly. I nodded. "You didn't need me to say anything. You already knew what was right." He smiled, a little uncertain but proud. I picked up my basket and continued shopping, though the energy in the store had undeniably shifted. Mrs. Whitaker may not have changed her mind in that instant, but the moment wasn't just for her. It was for everyone in that store. For Aaron, for the young mother, for the teenage boy who whispered, "He's so calm," to his mother. It was a reminder that words have weight, that silence is a response, that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to speak, to hold up a mirror and to say, "This isn't right." As I walked to the checkout line, the cashier, a young woman who had been watching everything from behind the register, scanned my groceries in silence. Just as she handed me my receipt, she met my gaze. "You handled that with so much grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I gave her a small smile. "Thank you," I said. As I stepped out of the store, the warm Georgia sun hit my skin, golden light filtering through the clouds. It was just another afternoon, just another trip to the store. But somehow it felt like something had changed. Maybe not for Mrs. Whitaker, but for someone, maybe, just maybe, that was enough. I walked to my car, placing the grocery bags in the passenger seat. For a moment, I just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring out at the people coming and going from the store. Life moved on, just as it always did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I exhaled deeply and started the engine. The radio hummed softly in the background, but my mind was still back in that store, replaying the moment over and over again. The weight of history, the weight of words. How something so small, a few hateful sentences, could fill an entire room with silence. How a few simple truths could reshape that silence into something else. I pulled out of the parking lot, the warm savanna air carrying the scent of freshly cut grass through my open window. As I drove, I found myself thinking about my father. He had always been a quiet man, strong without needing to prove it. He believed in the power of dignity, in standing firm without ever needing to raise his voice. "People will hear you if you give them something worth listening to," he used to say. As a kid, I didn't fully understand what he meant. But today, standing in that grocery store, I felt the truth of his words more than ever. I turned onto a familiar street, lined with towering oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The houses here were old but well kept, front porches lined with rocking chairs and hanging ferns. My childhood home wasn't far from here, and though I hadn't lived there in years, something about driving these streets still made me feel grounded. I decided to take the long way home, letting my thoughts settle. At a red light, a car pulled up beside me. I glanced over to see a young woman in the driver's seat, her eyes flicking toward me before quickly looking away. At first, I thought nothing of it, but then she hesitated, rolled down her window, and motioned for me to do the same. I lowered my window. "Excuse me," she said, her voice uncertain. I was in the store. I saw what happened." I studied her face. She looked to be in her mid-30s, dark hair pulled back into a ponytail, worry lines etched into her forehead. "I just wanted to say—" She hesitated, then exhaled. "Thank you. For what you said. For how you handled it." I nodded, offering a small smile. "Thank you for saying that." She shifted in her seat, gripping the steering wheel. I should have said something too. In the moment, I just froze. I wanted to, but—" She shook her head. "I don't know. I guess I was afraid." I understood. Fear has a way of creeping in, paralyzing people before they even realize what's happening. "It's okay," I told her. "You're thinking about it now. That matters." Her expression softened. The light turned green, and she gave me one last nod before driving off. I watched her car disappear down the street. Maybe she'd remember this moment the next time she saw something wrong. Maybe next time, she wouldn't freeze. Maybe next time, she'd speak. Small moments, small choices. They add up. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the weight in my chest had settled. I carried my groceries inside, placed them on the counter, and stood in the quiet of my kitchen. The house felt still, peaceful. I looked down at the apples I had bought, thinking of Mrs. Whitaker's cart, how her hands had trembled slightly at the end. I wondered if she was still thinking about it too. Change doesn't happen all at once, but sometimes a single moment is enough to start it. That night, as I sat on my back porch, a warm breeze rustling through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that the moment in the store was far from over. Not for me, not for Mrs. Whitaker, not for anyone who had been there, standing in that tense silence, witnessing something larger than themselves. I took a sip of my tea, the steam rising in soft tendrils into the night air. The cicadas hummed in the background, their song rhythmic and familiar. I had always found comfort in nights like these, in the stillness, in the simplicity of just being. But tonight, my mind was restless. I found myself wondering about Mrs. Whitaker. Who had taught her to think that way? Had she always believed it, or had it been drilled into her, reinforced by time and the company she kept? Did she regret what she said? Or was she sitting in her own house, clutching the edges of her dinner table, still convinced that she was right? I didn't know. Maybe I never would. But I hoped, deep down, that something about today would linger with her. I thought about Aaron, the store employee who had spoken up. I thought about the woman in the car, the regret in her voice. Small moments, small choices, they add up. The next day I went about my morning as usual, a jog through the park, a quick stop at my favorite cafe for a cup of coffee. Life had a way of continuing, no matter what had happened the day before. But as I stepped out of the cafe, I saw something that made me stop. Standing by the curb, hesitating as if unsure of her own actions, was Mrs. Whitaker. She wasn't alone. A younger woman stood beside her, her daughter maybe. They were talking, but Mrs. Whitaker's eyes flicked toward me the moment she saw me. For a second, neither of us moved. Then slowly she took a breath, squared her shoulders, and started walking toward me. Her daughter looked surprised but said nothing. I waited. When she stopped a few feet away, she looked up at me, her mouth pressing into a thin line before she finally spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said," she admitted. I stayed quiet, letting her have the space to say what she needed. She shifted, looking down at her hands, then back at me. "I don't like being wrong," she said, almost as if the words tasted strange coming from her mouth. I offered her a small nod. "I don't think anyone does." She exhaled, long and slow. "I was raised to believe certain things, and I've believed them for a very long time." She hesitated. "But yesterday, I saw how people looked at me after I spoke, and I felt something I don't think I've ever felt before." She frowned, almost as if she were trying to put words to something she didn't fully understand. "Shame," I said gently. Her lips pressed together, but she didn't deny it. Her daughter, standing just behind her, was watching with wide eyes. Mrs. Whitaker nodded slowly. "I don't know if I'll ever fully change," she admitted, "but I don't want to be that person anymore." I studied her, looking for the truth in her words, and I saw it. People don't change overnight, not completely, but sometimes they take the first step, and that's where it begins. I nodded. "That's a start." She blinked at me, as if surprised that I wasn't angry, that I wasn't throwing her words back in her face. But anger wasn't what she needed. She needed to see that it was possible to change, to grow, to be more than what she had been before. "Well," she said, clearing her throat and shifting her purse on her arm, "I just thought I should say that." I nodded again. "Thank you for telling me." She hesitated, then turned to her daughter. "Come on, let's go." But before she walked away, she glanced at me one last time. "Have a good day, Denzel." I smiled just a little. "You too, Mrs. Whitaker." And then she was gone. I stood there for a moment, watching her walk away, and I thought, maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As I stood there, watching Mrs. Whitaker walk away with her daughter, a strange feeling settled over me. It wasn't triumph, not exactly. I hadn't won anything. This wasn't about winning. It was something quieter, something heavier. Change is a slow-moving thing. It doesn't happen in a single moment, no matter how powerful that moment might be. It takes time, effort, and sometimes a willingness to sit in the discomfort of realizing you've been wrong. Mrs. Whitaker had taken a step, just one, but that was enough to shift something inside her, and maybe even in the people who had been there that day, witnessing it all unfold. I turned back toward the cafe, realizing I had been standing still for too long. As I stepped inside, the barista behind the counter, a young man with a neatly trimmed beard and a welcoming smile, looked up from where he was making a cappuccino. "Hey," he said, "I saw what just happened out there." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You did?" He nodded. Yeah, and I was there yesterday too, at the store. For a second, I wasn't sure how to respond. I hadn't noticed him then, hadn't seen his face among the others. He wiped his hands on a towel and leaned forward slightly. I just wanted to say, it meant something. What you said to her, the way you handled it. I offered a small smile. Thank you. He hesitated, then added, You know, my grandfather used to tell me stories about what it was like for him, growing up in the South, how people used to talk to him, how they looked at him like he didn't belong. I nodded, understanding without him needing to explain. But he always said the same thing, he continued, that change starts with one person willing to speak. I let his words settle. Your grandfather was a wise man, I said. He smiled, then gestured toward the counter. Coffee's on me today. I chuckled, shaking my head. You don't have to do that. I know, but I want to. I considered arguing, but something about the way he said it told me to just accept it. All right, I said, nodding. Thank you. As I took my coffee and left the cafe, the warm Savannah air greeted me again. And for the first time in a long time, I felt lighter. Not because everything had changed, not because racism had been solved in a single grocery store conversation, but because one person had stopped, had listened, had thought about something they had never questioned before. And that meant something. Maybe it wasn't much, but maybe, just maybe, it was enough to start something bigger. And that was all I could hope for. As days passed, life continued, but something about that afternoon in the grocery store lingered. It wasn't just another argument, not just another moment of ignorance faced and walked away from. It was something deeper, something that had planted itself in the minds of everyone who had been there. Mrs. Whitaker didn't disappear from my thoughts, though I didn't expect to see her again. People like her, set in their ways, don't change overnight. But sometimes life has a way of forcing people to face the consequences of their own words. Weeks later, I was back at the same grocery store, picking up a few things before heading home. The atmosphere was as ordinary as ever, the usual buzz of conversation filling the air. But then, a commotion near the checkout caught my attention. Mrs. Whitaker stood there, her face tight with frustration as she fumbled with her wallet. Ma'am, your card's been declined, the cashier said, her voice kind but firm. Mrs. Whitaker's fingers trembled as she tried again, but the result was the same. The line behind her grew impatient. Whispers passed between shoppers, some shaking their heads, others glancing away awkwardly. This can't be right, she muttered, but her voice lacked the sharpness it once held. There was something else there now, something that almost sounded like fear. I can put these back for you, the cashier offered. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes darted around, searching for someone, anyone, to help. But the people who once might have rushed to defend her no longer seemed eager to do so. I watched, waiting. In the past, she would have stood firm, chin raised, unwilling to accept help from someone like me. But now, with nowhere else to turn, she finally looked my way. Our eyes met. There it was, that flicker of recognition, the memory of our last conversation hanging between us. She swallowed hard. Pride is a heavy thing to carry, and in that moment, I saw her struggling under its weight. I could have walked away. I could have let her feel the full burden of isolation, let her sit in the discomfort she had once so easily cast onto others. But that's not who I am. Without a word, I stepped forward and handed the cashier my card. Put it on mine, I said simply. The store went silent. Mrs. Whitaker's lips parted as if to protest, but the words never came. She looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw something I hadn't seen before. Humility, acceptance, regret. The transaction went through. The cashier handed her the bags and Mrs. Whitaker took them, her fingers trembling. Thank you, she whispered. It was barely audible, but I heard it. I nodded. Take care, Mrs. Whitaker. She turned, walking out of the store with slower steps than she had when we first met. As I grabbed my own groceries, I could feel the eyes of the other shoppers on me. Some seemed confused. Others nodded in quiet approval. One of them, a young woman who had witnessed our first encounter, approached me on my way out. Why did you help her? She asked. I thought about it for a moment before answering. Because people don't change when you punish them. They change when you show them a different way. She nodded slowly, processing my words. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting golden light over the street. I watched Mrs. Whitaker disappear around the corner, knowing I might never see her again. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that a choice had been made. A door had been left open. For her, for everyone watching, for whoever might need to remember that change isn't about who wins or loses an argument. It's about what happens next. Now, to those of you who have followed this story, I have a question for you. Have you ever been in a moment like this, where words hung in the air, where silence felt heavier than anything else? Did you speak up? Did you walk away? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed change happen in real time, or been a part of it? And if this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that make us think, challenge us, and remind us of who we are. Because at the end of the day, we all belong here. And the way we choose to show up for one another, that's what truly matters.